Okay. Well, I've been teaching through the Gospel of Matthew, of course, for a very long time, and we're now in that part of the year where I'm going to be doing the great majority of the preaching on Sunday mornings, so we're going to be, clipping through Matthew at a bit faster pace these days. So we're just going to keep going for the most part. And I do plan to have a break coming up soon from Matthew to do some other things, but for a while yet, we've got some ground to cover yet here in Matthew, so we're going to keep doing that. And of course, I've divided Matthew up into 7 different sections based on what I think he's doing at different parts of his gospel, and we're in that 7th section, the final one, in which we see Jesus, with sovereign humility, is murdered on the cross for the forgiveness of our sins and is resurrected in victory to inherit God's kingdom. So we have come to really the gospel itself, as I've been continually calling it here in the 7th section of Matthew. And moving through all of that, we of course have I love my outlines, so we've divided the sections into portions. And we're in the second portion of this final section of Matthew. And in this portion, we see Christ subjected to humiliation as he is arrested, abandoned, and put on trial. And the key word, of course, for all of this is humiliation. And a very simple definition of humiliation, as I've been telling you, is it means you're being treated as worse than you deserve or worse than you think you deserve, to the point that it causes you great sorrow and shame. And that is very much what Jesus is undergoing through all of these things, because he is being treated most shamefully and would be grievous to anyone. But these are things he undergoes as part of his sacrifice for sin. Now, recently we've been studying the late night trial of Jesus before the high priest and the Sanhedrin court in Jerusalem, which was the supreme court of that time and place. So at least among the Jews, you couldn't go higher up than these people who are putting Jesus on trial now. And in my previous sermon, I raised all of the problems and all of the weightiness with the question that was presented to Jesus at his trial. Are you the Christ, the Son of God? And I spent a good amount of time just showing you all that was packed into that question, all the traps with regard to answering it, even if Jesus answers truthfully. I really, leaned into that quite a bit. And as we proceed through this passage, we will eventually be able to resolve all that tension that I created and see how Jesus' answer was the best possible answer that could be given and very meaningful for those people there, especially putting him on trial. But, that's kind of a long project as we go through the trial of Jesus, so that's kind of the agenda going forward. Today I have something a bit humbler in mind, just as we trek through the trial of Jesus. Just one detail that I want to talk about, and that is the silence of Jesus during his trial. Because even though we're building toward Jesus answering a very important question, he is mostly silent during his trial. Let's read this passage. So again, this is Matthew 26, and starting in verse 57, let's read through verse 67. And you'll see the silence that I am thinking of here. So those who seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. But Peter was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and entered in and sat down with the officers to see the outcome. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus so they might put him to death. They did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. But later on 2 came forward and said, "This man stated, 'I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days.'" The high priest stood up and said to him, "Do you not answer? What is this that these men are testifying against you?" But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? Behold, you have now heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They answered, "He deserves death." Then they spat in his face and beat him with their fists, and others slapped him and said to him, "Prophesy to us, you Christ, who is the one who hit you?" So I'm calling my sermon today "The Loud Silence of Jesus," which I think is fitting given everything we're going to study today, the loud silence of Jesus. On the one hand, we may find it truly odd that Christ was so silent during his trial when he has been, technically, the most talkative person so far in the gospel story. I mean, the gospels are about him. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, without exception, are about Jesus, and they're mostly about the words and deeds of Jesus. So, I mean, he's been the primary talker this whole time, and now he's silent. However, the silence of Christ on this occasion has great meaning, as do all the deeds of Christ. I trust you have seen that by now, that everything Jesus says and does is packed with meaning, and the same is true even when he says nothing. So my sermon today has two main headings as I break it down into parts. First, I'm just going to comment on the two ways in which the silence of Jesus was very strange. Why anyone would view this as odd for him to be so silent. And then in the last half of my sermon, I'll provide four ways in which the silence of Jesus was meaningful, showing again that there is a reason for his silence, and in fact, four reasons if you want to be technical about it. So today's sermon is a very brief one, and that is in keeping with my normal practice for preaching shorter sermons after Thanksgiving. I don't know how appreciated that is, but I think in some places people are still kind of recuperating from Thanksgiving holidays at this time, but nonetheless, I usually do a shorter sermon, and this is the shorter sermon for this year after Thanksgiving. And I suppose technically we have very little to discuss since we're focusing on Jesus saying nothing during his trial. There's not a whole lot, even though I have a sermon about it, not a whole lot to say about him being silent. But even when Christ says nothing, his actions still have a great enough meaning to fill a short sermon. So I figured this would be the sermon for today and just spend a little bit of time talking about Jesus and his silence at his trial and why he was so silent. So let's consider the silence of Jesus during his trial today. And let's proceed to that first half of things that I wanted to talk about. I want to give two ways in which the silence of Jesus was strange, and just to map out what thoughts we might be having as we come to this, and maybe perhaps some things you haven't thought about. But two reasons that the silence of Jesus was strange at his trial. First of all, the silence of Christ was strange because of how effortlessly he silenced all of his enemies earlier that week. So, very recently, Jesus was the guy who, by his words, was putting other people to silence and making them be quiet. And now he's willingly just not saying anything, it seems like. And if you don't remember what we're talking about, I'm talking about chapters 21 and 22 of Matthew. So after Christ arrived in Jerusalem during the final week of his ministry, he was challenged by representatives of every faction in Jerusalem. There is a scene there where they just kind of come to him like an assembly line, posing their questions and their traps to him, which is all they really were trying to do at that point. And, he is just dealing with them one by one. The enemies of Jesus challenged him on matters of his own authority, questions about taxes to Caesar, questions about the final resurrection and marriage, 2 in 1, and then questions about the greatest commandment. And just one by one, all different kinds of questions covering a lot of different topics. And these questions came from the chief priests, they came from the scribes, they came from the elders, all of whom composed the Sanhedrin, which again was the Supreme Court of Israel, the very people putting Jesus on trial right now. So a lot of the very same people who are now standing in judgment over Christ have already had a very direct encounter with Jesus, and it did not go well for them. But in addition to those men, we also have Pharisees, Sadducees, and Herodians, all of whom occupied some kind of prominent place in Jerusalem for one reason or another. And Jesus dealt with them the same way. Christ refuted all of these men. Every time they brought a question to him, he answered it in a way that they could not respond to and which they did not expect. Christ even stumped them with a difficult question of his own. At the very end of all of this, just to kind of put the final nail in the coffin, to use the expression that we sometimes use for that. And how did that end? Well, at the very end of that, this is Matthew 21, verse 46, or actually, let's back up. Actually, it's 22. Yeah, Matthew 22, verse 46. This is how that whole section of things ends. No one was able to answer him a word, nor did anyone dare from that day on to ask him another question. So they were so humbled, or I guess they should have been humbled. They were at least humiliated. They felt humiliated, we'll put it that way. They did not come out on top of this challenge to Jesus. He systematically, one by one, answered them all so well that they didn't have anything more to say. They didn't dare raise any more questions. So Jesus has been in the practice, even that very week, like we're talking like a few days ago from this point in the gospel. He has been the one silencing other people, but now he is the one maintaining silence without response. I mean, how is that? These are higher stakes. I mean, this is his trial, right? I mean, surely if there's any time to, whip out that wisdom and that, very convincing way of speaking, surely it's now, but he's not saying anything. Even to some of the very same men that he so adequately and forcefully humbled earlier that week. It's very odd that he's not saying anything right now. Now, the silence of Christ is even stranger when we compare that silence to how vocal the Apostle Paul was when he was on trial. Because let's not forget, this is not the only time in Scripture we see a man of God on trial before ungodly people. And there's a lot to learn by comparing these events. And if we compare the conduct of Christ during his trial to the conduct of Paul during his trials, it's actually really stark in terms of how different it is. When we get to the book of Acts, chapters 21 through 26, we see Paul arrested in Jerusalem, delivered into Roman custody, and put on trial, which is a very similar set of events. I mean, there's basically the same framework there as in the trial of Jesus, in terms of him getting arrested in Jerusalem, very much accused by the Jews and in the custody of the Romans eventually. Now, the thing about Paul is whenever you read that part of Acts, whether Paul is dealing with mobs, Roman officers, Jewish councilmen, Roman governors, or petty kings, Paul speaks a lot. Seriously, Paul went through an assembly line of his own, I guess you could say, dealing with all these different kinds of people during his legal problems. And he is always talking. He doesn't really stop. We actually learn more about Paul the man and his motivations from his trials than we learn about him from anywhere else in Scripture. Even in his letters, Paul usually doesn't talk a whole lot about himself, but during his trials, Paul talks a lot about himself and what drives him, what Christ means to him, and all those kinds of things, and a little bit about his early life and his personal life. I mean, Paul is just constantly going. He'll talk to anybody during his trials. So clearly, a righteous man of faith can speak in his own defense. I mean, Paul is very much held out to us as an example of a faithful Christian evangelist. He wrote like a third of the New Testament. I mean, he's one of the few people in all of history who can say things like, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Something that hardly anyone is even willing to say. So clearly, it's not wrong to speak a word in your defense when you're on trial, especially on trial for your faith. But then you have Jesus, who is in a very similar situation and is completely and totally silent until he basically has no choice but to answer, and then says one thing. It's very different, very odd. So all that to say, the silence of Jesus during his trial is very strange. Now, with all that strangeness, let's see if we can kind of decipher the meaning of that. And is there some significance to his silence at this time? Well, I have 4 comments to make, 4 ways in which the silence of Jesus was meaningful. So I think there is something to say about Jesus' decision to remain silent during his trial. So first of all, the silence of Jesus fulfilled the word of God. So I'm talking about Scripture in particular, and I guess more specifically than that, prophecy. But the silence of Jesus fulfilled the Word of God. As the Messiah, who was described by the prophets long before, Jesus had to fulfill certain expectations. He has to very much show that he is coming in the fulfillment of Israel's hopes about the Messiah. And Jesus does make an effort to do that. Well, one of those expectations, if anyone had wisdom to read it and understand it, that is, but one of those was silence in the face of suffering. And of course, the classic passage on this is Isaiah 53, verse 7 in particular. This, of course, is the servant song, as we call it, about the suffering of the servant. But Isaiah 53, verse 7, just to read one part of it, it says, "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, he did not open his mouth." Now, we might hope that somebody at that trial would remember the silence of Jesus on the eve of his death, and later, perhaps, having heard Isaiah's prophecy read yet again, might make the connection and be like, wait a minute, that's kind of how Jesus was at his trial, right? I mean, like a lamb before its shearers is silent, he opened not his mouth. But regardless of whether any of them made that connection, we have made that connection, and Christians have made that connection. And we see exactly what's going on as we compare the prophecy of Isaiah to the conduct of Jesus at his trial. We see that he is fulfilling the word of God by his silence at his trial. He is very much stepping into the role as the sacrificial lamb, the final sacrificial lamb, who's going to die for the sins of the world. And part of that is going meekly and without contest, very much like a sheep does. So, therefore, Jesus is silent at his trial. But of course, all of that just raises another question. Why is that part of the Messiah's attitude, the Messiah's composure? Why is that part of the expectations regarding the Messiah? Well, we have more to say about that and the silence of Jesus. So let's move on to the second observation. The silence of Jesus was submission to God. It was very much him humbling himself under God and obeying God. So his silence was submission to God. For Jesus to be our Savior, he must be like us, so he can sympathize with us and be our representative before God and be our example. And that's also part of the mission. It's one thing, on the one hand there's part of that as being our high priest and being the one who makes atonement for us, but also we've got to know how to live after all of that, so he's got to be our example. So all of that's important. And very often, we have no choice. Speaking of us now, we have no choice but to endure silently what has been appointed for us. Sometimes there's just nothing to do. I mean, Angela was talking before about sometimes things being difficult and having doubts about the promises of God and not knowing what's going on. Sometimes when you get in those states, you just have to sit there and take it. You don't know what's happening. You don't really know what God's doing. You might trust him, but you don't really understand. And sometimes you just have to deal with that for what it is. And yes, of course, we trust in God and we believe him when he says that he's working for our good, even in the worst of times. But still, God appoints all sorts of things for us, which can be difficult to bear. It doesn't stop us from having to bear them. It is difficult sometimes. And there are times, of course, where we deserve some of that trouble. Maybe we brought it upon ourselves. But there are also plenty of times where that's not the case. Sometimes it's just stuff that hits us out of nowhere. And in all of these times, despite all the frustration and sorrow, we very often have no choice but to wait patiently for God to finish his work until he says we are done with that suffering. That's just very often how it goes. You may not see the big picture, but God sees the big picture. He knows this time of difficulty has to last this long, and that's what's going to happen, and you just have to be patient. Very often it comes down to that. Now, Jesus entered into all of that, first of all, by becoming a man to begin with. I mean, when the Son of God became a man, he took upon all the human difficulties as part of being a man. But also, through his silence at this point. For someone who, again, is the most talkative person throughout the four Gospels, you don't usually get to see him just sort of silently enduring adversity. But here, at least at one point, he did that. He very much modeled what it means just to sit there and humbly wait for God to finish what God is doing. And of all men, he had the most right to complain, to seek justice, or at least to state his rights boldly. You look at a guy maybe like Job whenever he's talking in his book, and we know that Job was a righteous man and that his suffering was not because of sin, but sometimes you're reading Job's stuff and it's like, man, he's complaining a lot. I mean, shouldn't he be just like silently enduring? Well, it's really hard to do. Well, Jesus, he's even more righteous and perhaps has even more right to complain, but he's not complaining at all. He's not doing anything. He's not lifting a finger in his own defense. He's just taking it. He entered fully into the human situation, reduced entirely to waiting on God and taking no action for his own sake, not even daring to speak a word on his behalf. And in that sense, he becomes an example for us and shows us that he is very much enduring the kinds of things that we must endure from time to time. So there's a second meaningful reason for Jesus' silence at his trial. Now, my third observation is that the silence of Jesus was a rebuke to sinners. And in that time in his trial, he is completely surrounded by sinners at that moment, for sure. But his silence was a rebuke to sinners. Whenever someone asks us a question or makes a comment that we consider awful, we might say something like, I am not even going to dignify that with a response. So you maybe hear that as a stereotype, sometimes a bit overblown, and technically you're still responding, so is it really doing everything you're hoping it's going to do? Probably not, but the basic idea is there. Sometimes the things people say to you or do to you, it's not even worth it to even say anything. It's very often the case. Sometimes the best rebuke is just no rebuke at all, to show them that you care so little about what they're trying to do, and you think so little of them and their evil that you're not even going to say anything. Now, Jesus exemplifies that by not answering any of the charges against him brought by his enemies. I mean, here they're bringing in all these false accusations and all these people saying things about him that are false. I mean, the Bible says they're false. And he's just not even bothering. He knows as well as anyone else does in their right mind, as Pilate would say whenever he gets to see Pilate eventually, that it's totally because of envy that these guys are putting him on trial and trying to put him to death. It's not even worth it trying to argue with people that are so steadfast in their wickedness. So he doesn't. He doesn't even dignify their accusations and their arguments with any kind of response at all. The one time Jesus actually does speak in his trial, he does not actually answer his enemies, but answers God, in a sense. Because the one time he speaks in his trial is when the high priest says, I adjure you by God, and then asks the question. And I mentioned last time I spoke that to adjure someone is to put them under oath. So to say, I adjure you by God, is to put someone under oath to God. So now, in this case, if Jesus doesn't answer, he would be, in this case, affronting God or offending God. And that's the one time Jesus answers. It has nothing to do with the high priest. It has nothing to do with the accusations brought against him. It has nothing to do with anyone there. It is totally Jesus' reverence for God that makes him answer at that moment. So he's still technically not even answering them. If they had not invoked the name of God, he probably would have kept on being silent. So the silence of Jesus throughout his trial is very much an implied rebuke to these men who did not deserve to even hear his voice for a moment. They already had more grace than they deserved by far, hearing him earlier that week speaking truth. And, they had their chance to respond to that truth at that time. They rejected it, and they rejected him, and so he has nothing further to say to them. Well, fourth and finally, the silence of Jesus was part of dying for sinners. And I very much want to make this a part of, him working out the atonement, him actually dying in our place to take the wrath of God for our sins so that we could be forgiven. Now, God deals with sin in only two ways. Like the whole history of the Bible, there are two ways that God deals with sin. Either the sinner pays for it, or Jesus pays for it in his death, taking our place under God's justice. And throughout the Bible, you see God pouring out his wrath on people who have sinned and just making them pay the penalty for it. And of course, that's the idea of hell. This is the place where you do pay for your sins for as much as they are worth, which is infinite. But the other way, of course, is God's plan of salvation, in which Jesus himself bears the wrath of God on himself as though he were the sinner, even though he's not, and takes our punishment upon him. Those are the only two ways that God deals with sin. Now, in the event that any of you must pay for your own sins on the day of judgment, you will be absolutely silent when God hands down his judgment. So if you're ever wondering what that's going to be like, if you stand in judgment before God, well, if you are an unbeliever, if you're not trusting in Christ for salvation, if you have rejected him the same way these men rejected Jesus, you're not going to be saying much, because you're not going to be able to answer those charges. No one can oppose God. His glory overwhelms even the proudest hearts, and in the end, we cannot argue against what is true, that we are sinners, and that we deserve the punishment we receive. There's not going to be any contest there. There is not going to be any arguing your case before God in the day of judgment, if indeed you're destined for that, if indeed that's where you're going right now. But I think that's part of the reason Jesus was silent during his trial. Even though none of those accusations against him were true of him, they were all true of us. I mean, whatever terrible things they were saying about him, whatever sins they were trying to credit to him, that's true absolutely of people in the world. We are sinners. We are the ones that deserve to be stood up there and have accusations thrown at us all day long, because sure enough, some of those accusations are going to hit the mark. Because we've all sinned in some way, and we all deserve the wrath of God in some way. And if we ever have to face God in that context, in that way, we're just going to respond in silence, because there's no way to answer. And Jesus steps into that role during his trial. The trial itself is unjust, but the concept of a trial is very real, and God is the ultimate judge. And sinners before God are silent. And so Jesus in his trial very much imitates all of that. So he just takes it. He takes all of these accusations, says nothing against them, very much stepping into the role of a sinner so that he can die for sinners and have sinners forgiven by his death. And that, I think, is maybe the last significant reason, at least that I could think of, for the silence of Jesus during his trial, that is. All right. Well, that then overall is what I think is the meaning of the loud silence of Jesus. And just the loud silence because it's very notable, but also very meaningful. And I just want to give you a review of things that I've said, just as I always do, and then we'll be done with the sermon for today. First, I commented on two ways in which the silence of Jesus was very strange. And first, I appealed to the earlier debates between Jesus and these very men standing in judgment over him. We just saw that, he silenced those men himself, so he's quite capable of defending himself and silencing other people. So it's kind of odd he's not doing it now. And then finally, I appealed to the later example of Paul during his trials, in which we see that a man of God can speak in his defense during a trial, but Jesus isn't doing that. So yeah, the silence of Jesus is odd, but there are 4 reasons why maybe he was silent. The first reason for the silence of Jesus was he was fulfilling the word of God, specifically Isaiah 53, and not opening your mouth when you're being led to the slaughter like a sheep. Secondly, the silence of Jesus was submission to God, showing that he was trusting God and just following through God's plan without complaining or grumbling or even lifting a finger for himself. And then third, the silence of Jesus was a rebuke to those sinners, because really their wickedness was so extreme at this point they don't even deserve an answer. And then finally, the silence of Jesus, I think, was part of dying for sinners. He's stepping into the role of a sinner who cannot make any defense for the sins they've committed. Even though Jesus was innocent, he is very much stepping into that role for us to take our punishment. So those those are my observations on the silence of Jesus. There could perhaps be more. I would not be surprised if there are more, but those are the ones I thought of and the ones I wanted to share today. Well, next time when I speak, so probably a week from now, I want to speak more about one of the accusations brought against Jesus, the one that is actually stated for us in the text, and that is this comment about destroying the temple and rebuilding it in 3 days. It's the one actual accusation that is recorded before we get to Jesus testifying regarding himself. So that detail in itself is worthy of some clarification, and I want to talk about it at length. Also, this will be part of our effort to resolve the tension over the question that later gets asked Jesus, are you the Christ, the Son of God? So the stuff that is said about the temple is going to kind of pull into that in some way as we're kind of building our way, kind of building an argument through this passage here. But that's where we're going next, this statement about the temple, and I just want to clarify it, comment on it, and do a sermon on it. So next time, that's what I'll be doing. Are there questions, excuse me, are there questions or comments about today's sermon, anything I said that you want to ask or say, and before we do our mealtime?